Hello, this is Courtney Britton with the Texas Wildlife Association. Thank you for joining us for today's Wildlife for Lunch. The topic is forest management and wildlife on private land in eastern Texas, and it's presented by Dr. Chris Comer, Professor of Wildlife Management at Stephen F. Austin State University. Wildlife for Lunch is made possible through funding provided by the San Antonio Stock Show and Rodeo Livestock Exposition, Inc., and it's hosted by the Texas Wildlife Association and the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. Today's Wildlife for Lunch webinar does qualify for 1 hour of general CEU credit for those attending the live webinar. Here's how to get your credit. You must attend the live webinar. Unfortunately, viewing archived webinars does not qualify for CEU credit. At the end of the webinar, a post-webinar survey will pop up in your window, and you must complete that post-webinar survey. In that survey, it asks for your name, address, and either applicator's license number or driver's license number. Please make sure and fill those sections out. Once those have been done, we will get the CEU certificates emailed out to y'all, and usually about 5 to 7 days. It may take just a little bit longer because of the holidays, but they will be forthcoming in your email inbox. If you have any questions or concerns at all about CEU credit, please don't hesitate to contact me, Courtney Britton, at TWA. I can hopefully answer any of those questions for you. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Comer here. Just 1 second. Let me get you the set up here to drive the slides. Okay, Dr. Comer, it's all yours.
Courtney, I appreciate that. And I appreciate everybody who's taken time out of their busy holiday schedule to listen to what I have to say today. I'm really excited about the chance to be part of the webinar series. It's a really neat thing. So upfront I have to say this is my first experience doing an online webinar, so I apologize in advance for the times when I will be talking about, as you can see here, something like that, and I'll be in my office pointing at my computer screen, which none of y'all will see. So hopefully I won't do that too much, but I do apologize for that in advance. This is a big topic to talk about. When I talked to Courtney early on, and she said, well, talk about forest management, wildlife on private land. It's a really applicable and relevant topic, but it's one that I basically teach an entire semester-long course about here at Stephen F. Austin. So trying to take all that and combine it, condense it down into a 50-minute or so webinar was a challenging thing, and hopefully I've accomplished that okay. I'll basically start out with some basic background information, real basic stuff about what forests can do for wildlife, talk about some of the tools we have to manage wildlife in forested habitats, and then some what I hope are relevant sort of case studies at the end. We'll talk about some stuff that I think will be applicable to some of our listeners, and hopefully we'll cover the stuff that y'all want to hear. So kind of jump right into that. First of all, why are we talking about forest management in Texas? When I came to Nacogdoches in 2005 after I finished my PhD at the University of Georgia, and a lot of the my colleagues there, when I said, hey, I'm going to go interview for a job at a College of Forestry in Nacogdoches, Texas, they said, well, what does that have to do with forest resources? There's no forestry in Texas, and they all had this image of Texas as from what they'd seen in Western movies back in the day, where it was rangeland, open rangeland with tumbleweeds and the whole bit. And of course, as people on this call know, Texas has a lot of forest land. In fact, if you look at total acres of forest land in the southeast, Texas ranks second among southeastern states in total acres of forest land, behind only Georgia, as it turns out. So we have more forested acres than, say, Alabama or Mississippi or South Carolina or any of those states. So forests are really important in Texas. You can see on the map we show on the slide there, forested habitats are mostly concentrated in the eastern part of the state in the piney woods, but they do extend into other parts of the state as well. And one thing that I thought was interesting when I started preparing for this webinar, looking at some data that's out there, as many of you know, we had a tax valuation change in 1996, I believe it was, where you could get an agricultural exemption for wildlife management. And since that time, we've had over 2 million acres of forested land in Texas that is primarily used for wildlife management, at least for tax purposes. So not only is forest and fiber, forest products production important in Texas, but wildlife as an endpoint on forest land in Texas is really important for a lot of people. And so hopefully hopefully that's something that we're interested in. So from a very basic perspective, there are certain things, there are a lot of things, I guess, that forests provide for wildlife, but I'm going to talk about maybe 6 or 7 specific things that, when we're talking about implementing management practices on forested habitats, these are the things that we tend to focus on, and want to make sure we're sort of all on the same page about what these things are. And the first of those is one that's relevant certainly if you're interested in white-tailed deer, which I suspect many of you are, and that's browse. So browse is a term that's often misused, but browse technically refers to leaves and stems of woody plants, that is trees, shrubs, woody vines, things like that. And it's an aspect of habitat that's used extensively by white-tailed deer, but other species as well, rabbits and some other things, use browse quite a bit. And for deer, for example, browse on a year-round basis is the most important component of their diet. So on a year-round basis, in most habitats, they use more browse than anything else. And we have a lot of browse in our part of the world. In the southeast, browse is very abundant. We have a lot of plants that maintain green leaves and stems throughout the year. Think about yopon or some of these plants that maintain green leaves throughout the year. So browse is used 12 months of the year by deer and other species. And of more concern from a management perspective than really quantity of browse that's produced. We have, like I said, we have high quantity almost any time of the year, but it's the quality of that browse that often is something we're concerned with managing. So making that browse more palatable for species that use it, making it higher in nutrition, so they're getting more nutritional value from that browse, and things like that often are things that we are more concerned with than actually producing more browse. So we'll talk about some ways we can do that here in a little bit. One of the things that when we talk about managing forests for wildlife, probably the first thing that springs to most people's mind is massed production. Massed referring to the fruits, the fruiting bodies, whatever that is, of woody plants, trees and shrubs and vines. And typically when we talk about massed, most people think automatically of acorns. That's the most important probably type of mass we have in most of our forests, and certainly the one that people are most familiar with. So white and red oak massed acorns, very important for year-round nutrition for a variety of wildlife species, including many game species. But that's not the only type of mass we have. Another thing that we're blessed with here in the southeast is a wide variety of mass-producing species, including many species that produce a hard mass, like a nut. So we've got acorns, of course. We have several species of oak that produce acorns on a regular basis. But we also have a lot of hickories. We have beech nuts. See if this pointer works here. So this photo shows beech mass. Those of y'all that aren't familiar with beech mass, it's highly palatable, highly preferred mass produced by beech trees. Actually pretty good just to eat for people as well. And the other one I wanted to mention is one that we don't typically think of as massed in the lower left corner down here. That is, that's a seed from a longleaf pine tree. Longleaf pine and loblolly pine, for that matter, actually produce a pretty heavily used mass, particularly for quail and turkey. So if you look at year-round quail diets in places like Georgia and East Texas and Mississippi, there's a lot of pine seeds that are produced, and there's a lot of oak mast actually that is included in the quail diet. So mast includes, even hard mast includes more than just oak trees. Of course, most of our native species have to be on the order of 25 to 30 years old before they produce a significant hard mass, which is somewhat of a limitation in some places. But again, mass isn't just limited to what we consider hard mass, the nut-like fruits. Many of our species, and this is really where the southeast has an abundance of mass, is in the soft mast end. So we have a lot of species that produce berries and fruits that are widely used by wildlife. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with some of these things we're showing up here. We have blackberries, we have American beautyberry, we have red mulberry, wild grapes. Flowering dogwood produces a really heavily used soft mast. And for many wildlife species, including some of the game species, so wild turkeys, for example, use a lot of soft mast. Black bears use a lot of soft mast. But many of our wintering songbirds, and we have a wide variety and diversity of wintering songbirds here in East Texas, many of those species will heavily use this soft mast, particularly during the fall and winter time period. So these berries can be really valuable for a lot of wildlife species, and to the extent we can manage for them, that's probably a good thing for those species. moving on. One thing that we may not think about as produced by forests, when we think about forest management, we tend to focus on the shrubs and the trees because those are sort of the biggest and most obvious components of the forest. But for many species, including deer and turkeys and quail, the forest understory, including grasses and herbaceous plants, can be really important for them as a component of that habitat. For example, quail on a year-round basis, by far the most important component of their diet is seeds. That's grass seeds, seeds from forbs referring to broad-leaved herbaceous plants like goatweed and things like that. But seeds from those type of plants are very important to quail on a year-round basis, and to turkeys, and to a wide variety of songbirds that inhabit East Texas. So, and of course, we can encourage the growth of these plants, particularly annual grasses and forbs, for seed production for a variety of ways, through burning and thinning and some other things that we'll talk about here in a minute. So forbs and grasses can be really important for a lot of wildlife as well. And finally, the one that I want to mention, and probably even fewer people think about this as something that forests provide, and that's insects. But for many of our, particularly for species of conservation concern, like neotropical migratory songbirds, or bats, which I have an interest in bats. Insects are, in the case of bats, their entire diet. In the case of neotropical migrants, the most significant portion of their diet. And so if we can induce a forested habitat to produce more abundant insects, that's going to increase its habitat value for these species. And for some of our game species, like quail and turkeys especially, during really critical parts of the year when they have poults or chicks, those poults will eat a lot of insects, and that can often be the most limiting time of the year for those species. So producing more insects on these habitats can really benefit these species. In particular, the insects that tend to be most heavily used by neotropical migratory songbirds and turkeys and quail are moths and butterflies and the caterpillars that go along with the larval stages of those things, and then grasshoppers and crickets are really heavily used. So we want to think about ways we can produce that. A little bit difficult to predict exactly how to produce more insects, but in general, if we have plant communities that are very diverse, so if a diverse plant community, be that in the case of herbaceous plants or trees and shrubs, that will tend to produce greater variety and greater abundance of insects. And a more actively growing productive plant community is going to have more insect activity as well. So we can guide our forested communities toward producing those insects. That's going to be beneficial for these wildlife species. But forests don't just produce food for wildlife. They also produce various types of cover, including escape cover, which is escape cover refers to any cover that allows an animal to avoid predation or threats from potential predators. And then thermal cover, which allows animals, basically during the summer, to avoid climatic extremes of all kinds. So during the summer, to find a cool place where they can get out of the sun, maybe have to spend less energy sort of cooling off. And then during the winter, even here, but certainly as you get farther north from here, they need thermal cover to avoid cold winter temperatures, and that can be really important for birds and various other smaller species in particular. Of course, what constitutes escape or thermal cover is really species dependent, and different species use different things to provide that cover. For example, for white-tailed deer, we see in the middle, so this behind this deer, that constitutes escape cover for that deer. Notice how she's close to that escape cover behind her. She's looking at this is a picture taken with a remote triggered camera, but that deer, for a deer, basically escape cover is woody cover between up to about 3 feet in height. It allows them to get out of view of potential predators and feel less threatened by those predators. So that's escape cover for her. For a cottontail rabbit, it'd be much shorter, so we're only talking a foot or two in height, but again, dense woody vegetation. Over here on the left, this is a colony of southeastern myotis, which is a rare bat that inhabits bottomland hardwoods, and they, during the day, of course, they're active at night, and during the day they need somewhere they can, a dark place they can get out of the open, where they can be protected from predators, protected from warm daytime temperatures. And this is actually the middle of a hollow tree. So this is a black gum tree that's hollowed out in the middle, and these bats are roosting in that tree. So that's an important escape cover for it. This is a Virginia possum that is taking daytime cover in a hollow log. So there's a variety of forest structural attributes that can constitute escape or thermal cover. This is a Louisiana black bear, and this is a form of thermal cover. This bear is in a large, obviously it has to be a large tree to hold a black bear. She's inhabiting, for winter denning, she's using a large bald cypress tree, so she's inside that tree. And if you look carefully at this photograph down there, right below her face, that's a cub right there. Bears will produce, the cubs are born during their winter denning period, so that female bear, that sow, will find a good, secure place where she can get out of the cold winter temperatures and have her cubs. And basically, when they emerge from the den in the spring, they've got a little head start. They live with her in that den during the winter, so it can be really critical for these bears. And on the topic of cover, different types of cover, one of the most important and most species-specific types of cover we need, these animals need, is nesting sites. And they can, again, encompass a wide variety of things, can constitute nesting sites. The most sort of obvious and familiar one is cavity nest. This is the northern flicker. That's a primary cavity nester, meaning it excavates its own cavity in a snag or a dead portion of a living tree. But you also have secondary cavity nesters like the screech owl that will use an abandoned woodpecker hole. That's a screech owl there. So tree cavities can be really important. Of course, we can manage forests to produce more tree cavities by producing more snags. But nest sites can also include ground dens like the armadillo there. It can include shrubby habitats where cup nesters can construct their nests in a suitable place like this one. Even for wild turkeys, they nest on the ground, and so we want to have suitable cover for them to have appropriate nesting cover in these habitats. And finally, one that we may not think of as really a nest site, but as reproductive site is white-tailed deer. And in this picture on the bottom right there, that's a white-tailed deer fawn. If you wonder what that is, that's a radio collar that the deer fawn has on it. But this is a deer, and we got this picture from a project we did in Louisiana looking at fawn survival, and we found that having proper fawning cover was really critical to fawn survival and recruitment of fawns into that next year's population. Basically, in areas of our study site that had dense, abundant woody cover and herbaceous cover at ground level distributed across that landscape, fawn survival was pretty good. In another part of the study site that was a mature, closed canopy forest that had very limited ground cover, fawning sites were pretty poor, and we had very low fawn survival. I think 5 out of our 6 fawns were predated by various things. So even for something like white-tailed deer, proper reproductive sites can be really critical to occupancy and successful reproduction in that habitat. Okay, so we've sort of looked at some of the components of that forested habitat we may be concerned with managing, and of course they're species-specific, but with some general overall categories there. And we have a variety of tools that are available to us to manage forested habitats. Some of y'all may be familiar with Aldo Leopold. Back in 1933, Aldo Leopold wrote a book called Game Management, which discussed managing various types of habitats for wildlife. And he identified several tools in that book which are still relevant to the way we manage habitats today. Among those ones we're going to talk about today, he talked about the axe, which is cutting trees. He talked about the match, or prescribed fire, as a management tool. And then he talked about the plow, or ground disturbance as a way to manage habitats. He also talked about grazing, the cow. We're not going to talk about grazing so much, although that can be a management tool for some forested habitats. It's a less commonly used one in forested habitats. But the first one that tends to come to mind when we talk about managing forests is cutting trees for a variety of reasons. Primary among those being that many, certainly private landowners that have forest land that they're maintaining over time, one of the reasons that they're maintaining that forest land is because they want to derive some income by harvesting trees out of those forests. And so to the extent we can use that harvest, that income-generating harvest, to also benefit wildlife, that's going to be sort of getting 2 for the price of 1, right? If we can harvest trees, get some income from harvesting those trees, and benefit the wildlife on those properties, that's going to be good for us. So most landowners want to be able to harvest trees, and I think we can harvest trees in a way that's going to benefit wildlife. And we can design, there are a lot of different harvest strategies that are out there, and strategies for regenerating stands. And which one we want to choose is going to be dependent on what our goals are, both from an income perspective and, more relevant for this presentation, what wildlife species are of concern for us. So I've listed, you could probably come up with another half dozen different types of harvest management, but I think they can all be sort of grouped into these 4 types of harvest: clear cuts, shelterwood cuts, group selection, and single tree selection. And that basically goes in order from the most intensive removal of trees to the least intensive removal of trees, at least on a per stand entry basis. And we'll go through each of these in turn. So by far the most commonly used harvest management strategy on forests in East Texas and throughout the Southeast is the clear cut system, basically where we harvest the vast majority, in many cases, all of the trees off a given stand all at once in a single entry, and remove those trees and take them off to the mill or wherever they're going to go. And then we regenerate that stand either by natural regeneration or, in most cases, at least in pine-dominated systems, by planting trees on that cleared area. And the clear cut, of course, is popular because most of our dominant timber species in the Southeast are very what we call shade intolerant. That is, they require lots of sunlight to grow, and so if we tried to grow them in a closed canopy, they would not grow successfully. So the best way to do is clear a lot of space, allow a lot of light to hit the ground, and allow these loblolly pine, most of our oaks tend to be shade intolerant, so they're going to grow best under a clear cut system. But thankfully for us, I guess, as wildlife managers, the clear cut system can be very beneficial for many of the species that are high priority for us, particularly white-tailed deer, but some other ones as well, quail, for example. Clear cut, even age management as we call it, is very beneficial for deer and many other species that are of interest to us, because it tends to generate a lot of early successional, that is, shrubby and herbaceous growth immediately following harvest, such that there's a lot of abundant food and cover available for deer and other species immediately following that clear cut. As we get later into the stand, it tends to decrease, which I've got a graph I'm going to show you here in a minute that illustrates that. But certainly early in the stand, the clear cut system is really beneficial for these shrub favoring species like deer. So this is the graph I referred to. I made this graph up, and I basically hammer my poor undergraduate students with making them learn this graph. But it's pretty simple, and I think it sort of expresses what we're looking at with managing wildlife in this even age system, like a clear-cut system. We're basically, on the left-hand side there, on the y-axis, we could include a variety of titles there that would be true. So we call it wildlife diversity. We could say bird abundance. We could say bird diversity. We could say mammal abundance. All of these would be true and show the same general pattern that I'm showing here, and that is that early in the life of that stand, you have a very drastic increase in diversity immediately following harvest, when you have all this dense shrub and herbaceous growth. It reaches a peak shortly after harvest, maybe 3 years following harvest, and then it declines very rapidly following that. And by, depending on site, between year 7 and year 12, you reach canopy closure. That is, those pine trees get big enough, they close the canopy off, no light reaches the forest floor anymore, and you get a rapid decline in wildlife use of that stand, and that decline in use basically persists throughout the rest of the life of that stand up until you harvest it again, depending where you are, anywhere between 24 and 35 years. And basically, as wildlife managers in this system, a couple of approaches we can take. One is to take that curve and try to extend that period of high diversity, high use farther into that stand, or recreate it farther into that stand, and we'll talk about how we do that within that stand. And the other way we can look at it is if we have a landscape, say if we're looking at a 2,000-acre property, if we manage that property correctly and stagger our harvest, some portion of our landscape is always going to be in that early portion, in this area of stand life, such that if we look at a landscape scale, parts of our landscape are always in that area that supports high wildlife diversity, high wildlife use, and that can help us to manage on a landscape scale. Okay, so to go through the rest of our harvest system, the Shelterwood system is a system where, rather than cutting all the trees at once, we will harvest between half and maybe 2/3 of the basal area, half of the trees out of that stand in our initial entry. Then we'll leave 1/3 of those trees or half the trees in the stand, and then we'll come back 3 to 5 years later and we'll harvest the rest of the trees out of that stand. And that can be very beneficial for some tree species that are shade intolerant but not as shade intolerant as, say, the pine species. So many of our oaks respond very well to a shelterwood system, where we harvest half those trees, we allow the remaining trees to continue to produce seeds and produce some advanced regeneration so that we have saplings that are 2-3 feet tall after 3 to 5 years. Then we go ahead and cut the rest of those big trees out, but it gives our favorite species a little bit of a head start as opposed compared to some of our really shade intolerant species like the pines and your sweet gums and stuff like that. So shelterwood is really good for oak reproduction and some other regeneration, and some other species as well. One harvest system that's very popular on public lands for a variety of reasons is what we call group selection cuts. Group selection is where we harvest trees in patches throughout the stand. And those patches can be anywhere from half an acre to 2 to 3 acres in size. And rather than harvesting the whole stand, we harvest these little patches, and we'll do repeated entries through the life of the stand such that over maybe 50 years, we've regenerated that whole stand. We've cut every tree in that stand before it got to be 50, 60 years old. But rather than cutting all at once, we space that out over time. And this is very popular on on public lands and on conservation lands for 2 reasons, I think. One, because it does tend to maintain an old-growth, mature forest character to that forest throughout the life of that stand. So we never have that sort of clear-cut situation where it looks like you've really caused some damage to that forest. And certainly clear-cuts are aesthetically not very appealing, and so on public lands those can be difficult to implement. Group selection looks nicer, and it maintains, for some of our forest interior wildlife species, you think about black bears or prothonotary warblers or some of our other species that really need a mature forest, it can be beneficial for them. Also, group selection, the idea with group selection is to mimic a natural gap phase succession. So in a natural, unmanaged forest, that forest will regenerate by having little clumps of trees distributed throughout the forest die or get knocked over, whatever, by wind or insect attack or disease or whatever, and then that forest regenerates in those gaps. Well, the idea with group selection is to mimic that process and thereby mimic the natural process in an unmanaged forest. And it works to a certain extent to do that. And finally, sort of the most extreme in maintaining a mature forest, what we call a single tree selection, where you'll go into a stand multiple times, basically repeatedly over time. You never have sort of a stand harvest point. You go repeatedly into the stand over time and mark individual trees for harvest. So you're really, in this case, maintaining a mature forest all the time and just getting some income out of that forest by harvesting trees. Can work really well if it's done right. What usually ends up happening with a single tree selection system, of course, if you tell a logger, hey, go in there and mark the trees you want to take out, but don't, take 1 out of 10 trees or whatever you want to do, what they will do is take the highest quality trees, naturally enough. They're going to take your tallest, your most valuable timber species, which often also are some of our most valuable wildlife species. So what you can get with single tree selection over time is a high-graded stand where after 20 years of doing single tree selection, the only trees left are the ones that are malformed, or they're not preferred species, or they are less valuable for a variety of reasons. So single tree selection has some risks there with ending up with a stand that it has very little value at the end. And a lot of times I've seen single tree selection systems, after 30 years, they will basically clear cut that stand because they've already removed all the valuable trees, and so you end up with an even age management system because you have no valuable trees left after 30 years. And anyway, but it can be a valuable system if it's implemented correctly. Okay, so moving on beyond strictly tree harvest, to me, the single most valuable tool we have, or practice we have, for wildlife in forested systems is thinning those stands. If you remember that graph I showed you where you had the wildlife diversity dropping off dramatically at canopy closure, well, one way we can address that is by thinning that forest, so then we no longer have canopy closure. We allow some light to hit that forest floor. We allow the growth of a lot of those things that are really valuable for wildlife, your forbs, grasses, shrubs, and vines that produce soft mass, produce browse, do all that stuff midway through that stand. And if we thin a stand multiple times throughout the life of that stand, we can maintain some level of wildlife use throughout the life of that stand. And that's really valuable. The nice thing about thinning also is that from a landowner perspective, if you thin at the right time, so wait a little bit longer into that stand life to do your thinnings, you're producing income throughout the life of that stand. So rather than basically waiting till that stand is mature to get any income from it, you're able to derive some income from that stand at several points throughout the stand life, 2 or 3 times throughout that stand. You can get some income, which is obviously appealing for the landowner. So thinning is one of those things that's nice because we can sell that from a wildlife perspective and sell it from a landowner income perspective. And one thing we may not think about with thinning, we tend to think of thinning, and thinning is at this point a component of almost every intensively managed pine rotation. So most rotations have 1 or 2 thins incorporated into their plan when they're looking at pine trees. But it can also have some benefits in hardwood stands. And one of the benefits we get from hardwood-dominated forests is, as we said, mass production. Well, mass production, particularly with oaks, but with other species as well, is closely correlated with the size of that tree's canopy. Canopy size is a better predictor of mass production than DBH in diameter at breast height, or height of the tree, or any other measure. The best way to predict mass production is size of the canopy. So by selecting certain mass-producing trees and thinning around those trees and allowing the canopy of those trees to expand, we can really increase mass production by those trees. So we can do a selective thinning in a hardwood stand and really improve mass production, which is really great for a variety of wildlife species. So thinning is really valuable. Some other tools, there's a lot of machinery that's available to help us manage woody vegetation. Everything from a roller chopper. This is a roller chopper over here. It's basically a drum filled with water or sand that you drag behind a tractor or a dozer that chops up woody vegetation and allows that vegetation to regenerate, gets it down within the range where wildlife can use it more beneficially, all that kind of stuff. Other types of mechanical manipulation include mulching. This is a mulcher. It can use to basically chop up small woody vegetation, again, allowing that vegetation to regenerate. And then finally you have things like shredders and mowers that you can use on smaller woody vegetation and to help with managing your herbaceous or grassy vegetation. So mechanical means are very highly preferred. They can be kind of expensive, especially with the price of diesel fuel these days, but certainly a valuable component of our toolbox for managing woody vegetation. One of our most highly preferred tools for managing forested systems, and grassland systems for that matter, but forest systems is fire. A couple of reasons for that. One, fire tends to be pretty inexpensive relative to other management techniques, certainly cheaper than herbicides or mechanical treatments. Also, fire is a natural component of almost every forest system in the southeast. So, you know, all of our upland forest systems, everything except really your deepest, wettest swamps in East Texas and the rest of the southeast, we're dependent on fire. So fire was a natural component of those systems at some interval. In some systems it may be up to every couple years fire, some it may be more on the 10 to 20 year rotation, but fire was a critical component of these systems. So by putting fire in that landscape, we are mimicking the natural system. And to me, when we can do that, that's generally preferred over something that's less natural, like say herbicides. But fire is certainly an important component of these systems and an important tool for us. And the results we get from fire are going to be highly dependent on what that community looks like, what our fuel loading is in that community. Certainly this community up here, you know, that's a mature forest with a closed canopy, not much fuel. That's going to be a cooler burn compared to something like down in the bottom left where we have a lot of fine fuels in that system. That's going to burn a lot hotter than the one in the top right. So it's going to be dependent on the season. In your summer burns, you get much more control of woody vegetation with a summer burn because those trees, those shrubs and stuff are actively growing during that season. You also tend to burn hotter, obviously, during the summer because it is hotter. You get much better control of those species with a summer burn than you do with a cool season burn. And then the frequency of burning is going to affect what we get out of it. So if you burn on a very short rotation, you burn every 2 to 3 years, you're going to end up with a grass and forb-dominated community underneath maybe some large trees, like a Longleaf Pine Savannah. If you burn on a longer rotation, say 5 to 8 to 10 years, then you're going to be producing a more shrub-dominated community, which may be more preferred for, say, white-tailed deer, for example. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. But fire can accomplish a lot of goals for us in a forested system. And finally, the tool that we want to talk about is herbicides. You know, herbicides certainly have a place in modern habitat management. There are a lot of really effective herbicides out there that have been developed for forestry, and they can accomplish a lot of different goals for us. Herbicides do tend to be more expensive, but in some applications they may be the only thing that's really going to accomplish the goals we want to do. In some cases, you know, we talked about fire as a natural component of systems. Well, fire may not be a practical tool to use in some locations. Say if you're near residential areas where that fire escaping out of your property can cause real problems getting into homes or something like that. Fire may not be practical. If you're near a highway where you have smoke issues, with smoke getting across a highway, or over an airport, there were some issues with Houston Intercontinental Airport several years ago where some fires were smoking in the airport, which obviously is a big concern. So fire may not be able to be applied everywhere. In those cases, herbicide treatment at a broad scale can mimic some of those effects of fire as far as setting back our vegetation community, removing woody vegetation, promoting herbaceous forb and shrub growth on those habitats. Also, herbicides are really valuable for controlling invasive exotic plants. As many of you know, we have a lot of exotic invasive plants in East Texas that really cause damage to our ecological communities and can really have some significant impacts on wildlife, things like Chinese tallow tree or Chinese privet or Japanese climbing fern, Chinaberry. There's a wide variety of exotic invasive plants, and for many of these plants, the only really effective treatment we have is chemical treatment, herbicide treatment. And so they can be really effective at that. And finally, one of the nice things about herbicide that you can't do with fire, it's very difficult to target an individual stem to kill with fire, right? You kind of have to burn over the landscape and hopefully it'll accomplish the goals you want. Whereas with herbicide, you can target individual stems. Say if you're doing a thinning in a hardwood stand and those trees aren't commercially viable, so you're not going to get any income by sending those trees to a mill, well, maybe we can herbicide those trees. You know, showing here we have a hack and squirt. This is where you hack a hole, you know, hack basically a section out of the side of that trunk, and then you spray herbicide into that area you've just created there to kill that tree. That tree's, one, it's going to thin that out to provide benefits to the adjacent trees. It's also going to provide a snag, which maybe can be used by a cavity nesting species. So we can target individual stems. This is an herbicide injector. That's sort of an old school way to apply herbicide. We don't do that too much anymore. But you're injecting that tree with herbicide to kill it. So if we want to target individual stems, very specifically, herbicides are great for that. So we can get a lot of benefits from herbicides. Okay, so that covers some of our basic tools that are in our toolbox for managing forested habitats. The remainder of the presentation, I'm going to talk about several different topics that hopefully will be relevant. I know this one is. White-tailed deer certainly are relevant for many private landowners in East Texas and across the state. And of course, deer are a forest species. They inhabit forested habitats regularly. So managing deer in forested habitats certainly is relevant. It's one that I have some personal interest to. I did my PhD work on white-tailed deer, so I certainly have some history dealing with deer. But in the southeast, deer are certainly abundant across the southeast. We're not in a situation really in any state in the southeast where we are concerned with restoring deer populations at this point. We're trying to manage to improve things like recruitment or antler quality or growth or things like that, really fine-tuning our deer herds to provide benefits to the recreational user in most cases. So, and there are a lot of goals we may have in regards to that, but I tried to focus down on three primary things we're interested in doing in forested habitats to improve those habitats for deer. Those including improving browse, mostly browse quality. Like I said, most southeastern forests, we have a lot of browse, but some of that browse may be, excuse me, not very nutritious. It may be difficult for deer to reach. It may have some, many of our native plants produce chemicals that are reduce the palatability or the nutritional quality of the forage for deer, things like tannins and things like that, that will make it less digestible. So if we can reduce the quantity of those compounds in the browse, that's going to improve quality. So improving browse quality, we also would like to increase mast production. As we mentioned, acorns and other mast are really important for deer on a year-round basis, particularly in the fall. They're getting ready to go into the winter food shortage period or going into that rut period. The high energy provided by acorns and other mast can be really valuable for deer, so we can increase mast production. And then in some cases, an interesting issue, there's a lot of study going on in the southeast right now about recruitment in a lot of states. It hasn't really been studied in East Texas, but in Georgia and Alabama in particular, they have documented on some sites declining recruitment. That is, their fawns are not getting the fawn crops they would like to get to maintain their deer at the level they'd like to see in some of those states. And the reasons for that aren't entirely clear. It does appear to be related to predation and maybe some habitat change that's ongoing in those states. So in some cases, maybe worried about improving recruitment, that is, improving fawn survival. And there's some ways we can do that, I think. So what can we do? Just to go over things really quickly, I mentioned timber management. Even-age timber management, clear cutting of pine stands almost always provides benefits, at least in the short term, for white-tailed deer. So if you take a mature, densely stocked pine stand with a closed canopy and harvest that stand, you're going to dramatically increase browse production, soft mass production, forb production immediately following that cut. And basically, clear cuts between the ages of, say, 2 to 3 and up to 7 to 9 provide excellent habitat for deer. They provide good escape cover, they can provide good fawning cover, and they provide abundant browse and soft mass for those deer. So, cutting trees is good for deer. So, another thing, as you could imagine, based on what I said earlier, thinning those stands is really beneficial for deer. And really, in a lot of cases, the more heavily you thin those stands, the more benefit you get from that thinning. Now, I know there's an economic trade-off there because you're reducing your stocking density on those stands when you thin them. But if you're concerned about deer, the more heavily you thin that, the more response of the shrubby browse-producing species, the more response you're going to get from your forbs. Deer eat a lot of forbs as well. The heavier you thin that, the more benefit you're going to get from thinning that stand for deer and for other species as well, but we're talking about deer right now. A heavy thin can really be beneficial for deer, and that thinning is going to last longer. If you do a very light thin, it may only persist for a couple of years. If you do a heavy thin, you may get 5 to 6 years of benefit out of that thinning. And you can often follow that thinning with with burning, which will promote even more extended growth of those browse species. And finally, I mentioned improving hardwood stands to improve mass production. Many of our hardwood stands are stocked with a lot of species that don't produce mass that's beneficial for deer. Their acorns, beech, species like that produce the most benefit for deer. To the extent we can change our species composition to favor oaks, that's going to help produce more for deer. It's going to increase that canopy to increase mass production from our oak species. So we can either selectively harvest trees out of that stand, or if we're not interested in getting some income from that, we can just girdle those trees or herbicide those trees to remove them from that stand and allow the remaining trees a little more space so they can produce more mast for us. And finally, I got out of order of my stands here, so either following a thinning or even in and of itself, burning can be really beneficial. Not only does it basically top kill our shrubby vegetation and cause it to regrow at a level that's more beneficial for deer, burning actually mobilizes nutrients into the soil and can significantly improve the nutritional quality of the browse that's produced following that burning. I've seen this multiple times. The best example I see in East Texas is with sweet gum. Most of you are familiar with sweet gum. It's a very common species in East Texas, grows almost anywhere, and it's not a highly preferred deer browse at all. You hardly ever see deer browsing certainly on mature sweet gum trees, but not even on sweet gum saplings in most stands. But if you burn that stand, sweet gum resprouts very vigorously following a fire, so you'll top kill that sweet gum sapling. that root collar will sprout very vigorously following that fire, and the deer will really heavily use that recent regrowth. Up to 2 or 3 months following the fire, you get really heavy use of sweet gum following that fire, and then it'll decline a little bit after that. But that new regrowth is very nutritious. It's low in those plant chemicals I mentioned. It tends to have high protein content because it is actively growing, so you can really improve browse conditions by putting a fire to that. And with deer, we're talking about usually burning during the winter, the cool season, so we don't really kill the plants. We just want to sort of top kill them, and burning on about a 3 to 6 year rotation to really maximize benefits for deer as far as browse and soft mass production. And finally, one I don't want to dwell on too long, we can use food plots and plantings to benefit deer, and I'm sure y'all are familiar with food plots. You could do a whole 1-hour webinar certainly on just food plots, so I'm not going to get into it too much. But food plots, by planting highly nutritious forage, we can increase the carrying capacity of our property because it is a much more nutritionally dense forage, higher protein per pound on these food plot plants than it is on your native browse. And we can also concentrate animals for observation and for harvest, which allows us to manage our deer more effectively. So food plots certainly have a place. And this is not to say that supplemental feeding and other things are not an important part of deer management. It's not really habitat management, so I'm not going to get into supplemental feeding as part of this presentation. Okay, another species that is very has a lot of interest here in East Texas are eastern wild turkeys, and this is the only part of the state where we have the eastern subspecies of wild turkey. And it's an interesting case with wild turkeys. We've done a lot of research here at SFA looking at wild turkeys and what their habitat needs are, and more importantly, what their limiting factors are here, because we've been trying to restore wild turkeys to this region basically for 25 years now. We started in 1979, and we have not had the success we've seen in some other states in the southeast. We have a huntable population in East Texas, but not at the numbers we would certainly like to see, and we're not sure for why that is. So we've been looking into that. And based on the research that we've done here and some other research at other places, we've basically identified 3 things that we can do to improve private lands, or public lands for that matter, for wild turkeys. The most important one probably is number 2, improving or creating brood habitat, but also improving nesting habitat and improving mass production can be really important for wild turkeys. Okay, so nesting habitat for wild turkeys, basically turkeys nest on the ground, and what we found the most important factor in having good habitat for wild turkeys was having dense woody vegetation between about 1 foot and 2 feet above ground level. Basically at a level where that turkey hen, the hens sit on this ground nest, and they want to be able to get down where a potential predator can't see her. So you get that dense woody vegetation that's in that range where she is, but then if she wants to stand up and look around, she can get a pretty good view of the surroundings around here. So we're looking at stuff between 1 to 2 feet in height. Is critical for nesting habitat. We like to have some, they'll dig out a little hole in some grassy vegetation to make their nest, and then they'll hopefully sit on that nest. So ways that we can improve nesting habitat is to thin our stands, and again, thinning, the more heavily we can thin, the better. You see this stand on the left here, that's a really good stand for turkey nesting, or this stand right here. And those trees are widely spaced. That stand has been heavily thinned, so it has some dense grassy vegetation, it has some dense low woody vegetation that it basically persists, such that we don't ever get complete canopy closure and don't lose that ground vegetation. We can also burn on about a 3 to 6 year rotation to create good nesting habitat for turkeys. Of course, when we're burning for turkeys, we don't want to burn basically any time after February, because turkeys, peak nesting for turkeys is in April in East Texas. And if we burn in March, we're going to basically remove that nesting cover to where it's not going to be regrown by the time we want to have those turkeys nesting. And obviously, if we burn in April, that's going to be a significant problem because we're going to burn up some nests. So we don't want to do fire during the nesting season. So late summer to late fall burns are really good for turkeys. Brood habitat, this was the single most important factor limiting turkey populations in East Texas, was the presence of brood habitat. And brooding habitat for turkeys is large openings dominated by herbaceous vegetation, grasses and forbs, particularly native species. Found this was very uncommon in East Texas. We have a lot of closed canopy contiguous forest in East Texas that doesn't provide good root habitat. And when we do have openings in our region, they tend to be dominated by improved pasture grasses, which generally are exotics like Bahia grass or Bermuda that don't provide benefits for turkey poults, which is what we're concerned now. So turkey poults eat a lot of insects, as we mentioned, and they need these bare ground areas dominated by by native grassland forbs, where that hen can take them out there and show them where those insects are, and those poults can find those insects and consume them, and allows them to grow rapidly and stuff like that. Basically, we found that openings had to be at least 2 hectares in size, that's about 5 acres in size, in order to be used extensively by turkey broods. We had actually radio tagged turkey broods. We found that they would only use openings that were greater than 2 hectares, which is pretty significant in size, and in an ideal world, up to 15% of a given property would be in openings to provide optimal turkey habitat, and that's a lot. That's a significant change to land cover on most properties, but if you want to have turkeys and have them successfully reproduce, that's the kind of scale of openings we need to have to successfully have turkeys. So that is a significant change for most properties, but I think it can really benefit turkeys in our region. And finally, we already talked about stand improvement, thinning in hardwood stands to improve mass production. Also, that burning and thinning we mentioned earlier is going to produce a lot of soft mass. Turkeys use a lot of blackberries and beautyberries during the summer, so it's going to be really beneficial for turkeys as well. So no reason really to go into that again. And finally, I know we're running up on time here, but aside from game species, that certainly are important for a lot of landowners, many landowners in East Texas, in addition to wanting to get some timber income from their property and maybe wanting to hunt those properties, they're also interested in conservation of rare declining habitats because they have an interest in wildlife in a more general sense, and certainly that would be true for me as well. And there are a lot of rare declining habitats in East Texas. I'm trying to just focus on 2 for this purpose, for this presentation, because I think these at one time were most widespread across the landscape and have declined to the greatest degree, I guess, compared to their historical significance in the landscape. And those are Longleaf Pine Savannah and Bottomland Hardwood forests. Both of those are very, very significant on this landscape. Everybody's probably familiar with Longleaf Pine Savannah. Certainly there's a lot of big attention being paid to restoration of Longleaf Pine Savannah in this area. Of course, Longleaf Pine Savannah classic savanna system basically extended from East Texas, we're at the western extent of the range, all the way up into North Carolina, maybe even a little bit farther north than that, in the Atlantic and Gulf Coastal Plain. Very significant, millions of acres of Longleaf Pine Savannah. Historically, have been much reduced down, depending on the state. In Texas, we're down to about 1.5% of our original acreage of Longleaf Pine Savannah, and most of that is on public land. There's a few places on private land that have Longleaf Pine Savannah. Characterized by open, large longleaf pine trees with a grass and forb-dominated understory, not much understory woody vegetation at all. Maintained mostly by frequent fire, historically between every couple years to up to maybe 5 years between fires, but very frequently burned, which is what allows that longleaf pine to persist in that landscape. Some of the wildlife associated with longleaf pine, of course, in most of the southeast, this is the species most associated with longleaf pine, for better or for worse. That's the red-cockaded woodpecker, which is a federally listed species. We'll stay away, and there's some mixed feelings about red-cockaded woodpeckers. Certainly there are species deserving of conservation, but they certainly arouse some concerns for valid reasons with private landowners with having a listed species. But one that we can all probably agree on as a good thing is this one, and that's the northern bobwhite, which, as most of you know, has declined precipitously throughout the southeast over the last 40 years for a variety of reasons. One of the most significant being changes in forest type from these savanna, either oak or pine savanna habitats with lots of grassy understory to the more closed canopy forests that we see over a lot of the southeast now. If you think about areas that have lots of northern bobwhites now in the southeast, like South Georgia, for example, they tend to be areas that have a lot of restored longleaf pine savanna. That's really what South Georgia looks like, and they have huntable quail populations still. It also benefits other species. This is a Louisiana pine snake, one of our rarest snake species in in North America. This is the Henslow's sparrow, which is a wintering sparrow we have throughout the southeast. And this is a Bachman sparrow, which is another rare sparrow that we have that breeds in East Texas and throughout the southeast. It's very highly dependent on longleaf pine savanna. I'm not going to get too much into longleaf pine restoration. There's a ton of literature out there, and y'all probably heard about it before. When I was looking at some example webinars to plan this, there are probably a dozen webinars out there about longleaf pine restoration, so no need for me to go through there. The best place to look for information about that is the Longleaf Alliance, really well-organized, well-put-together nonprofit organization promoting restoration of longleaf pine throughout the southeast. So I highly recommend, if you're interested, and I think some of you should be, in restoring longleaf pine, that's the place to go. They've got all the information you could ever want about longleaf pine. So I highly recommend going to that website and checking out what they have. There's a lot of free literature to download there. The other one that's really interest to me is the Bottomland hardwood forest. There's a lot of, again, another dominant forest system on the East Texas landscape historically that's been reduced for a variety of reasons, including reservoir construction, harvest, and then having those harvested stands replanted to things like loblolly pine or other non-hardwood species, maybe converted to improved pasture. A variety of reasons have been lost. And there's just a lot of variation in bottomland hardwoods. It provides lots of different wildlife species that are dependent on these bottomland hardwoods, ranging from what we consider real swamps, bald cypress, tupelo, to really mesic flats on the edge of these hardwood bottoms, dominated by cherry bark oak and some other species. So lots of different things incorporated into bottomland hardwoods. Some of the species that are dependent on them, from a game species perspective, of course, wood ducks are highly dependent on bottomland hardwoods throughout the year. Gray squirrel is also one of our sort of bottomland hardwood signature species. This one's kind of a little bit hard to tell. This is one of my species of interest. I've done some research on these guys. This is the Raffnest big-eared bat, which is a state-listed bat species that roosts in mature tupelo or cypress trees in these deep swamps, which is very, very much reduced from its former range. Louisiana black bear, another one that's closely associated with bottomland hardwoods in this region. And then there's a prothonotary warbler, which is a signature species of bottomland hardwoods, really beautiful species that inhabits bottomland hardwoods of the southeast. So lots of wildlife associated with these stands, and we can benefit those wildlife species by managing these hardwood stands or restoring them on some lands. Real quick, I got some more links for you. If you're interested in planting hardwoods, and there's actually a lot of financial assistance out there to provide some economic incentives for bottomland hardwood restoration through the Wetlands Reserve Program. That's a Farm Bill program, which may change with the new Farm Bill, but there's probably going to be something in there. They've restored hundreds of thousands of acres of bottomland hardwood forest in the Mississippi River Alluvial Valley through the Wetlands Reserve Program. Partners in Fish and Wildlife through Fish and Wildlife Service. And also one of the interesting things is mitigation banking. That's a system by which private landowners can agree to conserve or restore bottomland hardwoods or other wetland communities on their property. In exchange for that, when, say, TxDOT or some other agency is going to impact these wetlands, they need to mitigate for those impacts. They can purchase those conservation credits from the private landowner and actually provide some pretty significant income to private landowners through mitigation banking. So that would actually be worth a whole webinar in and of itself, talking about mitigation banking as a way to conserve bottomland hardwoods. And it's one of the most significant ways we conserve bottomland hardwoods in East Texas right now. There's thousands of acres preserved through that system at this time. I'm running up on 1 o'clock right now, so I'll go ahead and show you all my contact information. I'm more than happy if you have a question later, or you don't want to put that question in front of everybody, feel free to email me. That's probably the best way to get in touch with me. I tend to respond to emails more quickly than phone calls. I also have my office number up there. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you might have. And with that, I'm done.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Comer. Folks, if you are attending the webinar for CEU credit, we have reached the 1-hour minimum time requirement, so you can drop off if you want. But we're going to go ahead now and answer some of these questions. We've got some great questions in here. And if anyone out there still has questions, please type them into the chat window and we'll get these answered. Okay, let's see. Our first question is, how long should you wait between thinnings?
Sure, that's a really good question. And of course, All right, and for all wildlife biologists, our standard answer to any question we receive is it depends. But in this case, that's true. So if you're managing, let's say, managing a loblolly pine plantation for fiber production, but you want to get some wildlife benefits, then you're looking at probably 5 to 6 years between thinnings. You may wait a little bit longer before your initial thinning, maybe 10 to 12 to 15 years before you thin it for the first time. But if you want to maintain that, I guess, growth of understory vegetation, you're going to want to thin on every 5 to 6 years to maintain that. If you're in a mature bottomland hardwood forest, it's probably going to be less often because the trees aren't going to grow as fast to occupy that canopy. But so you're talking, maybe 10 to 15 years between thinnings in that kind of habitat. So hopefully that gives you some boundaries. But like I said, it depends on what your goals are for that stand.
Okay, great. Our next question comes from Mike, and he asks, what herbicide is effective on juniper trees for individual stem treatment?
Yeah, there are many herbicides that can be effective on a variety of trees. Juniper can be a little bit tough. Juniper is pretty responsive to fire as well, but for individual stem treatment, what we've gone to for smaller stems is a mixture of remedy, which is triclopyr, and mix that with diesel or some other surfactants that will allow that to penetrate the stem, and you spray about the bottom, foot to 2 feet of that stem, sprayed all around the stem with that mixture of herbicide and diesel or something else, and that will kill that tree dead as a hammer in most cases. And it's not too expensive. It's pretty easy from a backpack sprayer to do that. So that's really effective for that type of individual tree treatment.
Okay, and what about for oak trees?
That would work for oaks as well. Oaks are a little bit more sensitive, so you can probably do a wider variety of treatments on oak trees, but that would work pretty effectively. For bigger trees, then you're going to be wanting to go to that more. What I tend to do with the bigger trees is both girdle them, so you take a chainsaw or something and girdle around the diameter of that tree, and then spray herbicide in that cut that you've just created. So you sort of get a double whammy there. You girdle them, and then you herbicide them just to make sure you've really whacked them. And almost any herbicide will work for that, if you want to do that.
Okay. And our next question comes from Dan, who says, are there any sort of habitat indices, i.e. habitat types, that are beneficial to the greatest number of species? Not all species prosper in all habitat types.
That is absolutely true. And so, yes, there are some habitat types that produce the greatest diversity. And so, for example, our what we call early successional habitats, so the ones that are dominated by shrubs and forbs and grasses, tend to have the greatest diversity of birds, for example. So if just pure species richness or diversity is your goal, generally these early successional habitats have the highest diversity. An exception might be for, say, reptiles and amphibians. Those tend, like amphibians tend to be most diverse in, say, mature bottomland hardwood forests. But for the greatest number of species, these early successional habitats tend to be the most productive, so they have the most diversity. And so from that perspective, those habitats tend to be good. What also, the thing about those habitats is, in our landscape in East Texas right now, those tend to be pretty abundant habitats. So they do have a high diversity, but they also tend to favor species that are abundant on the landscape right now. So if you're really concerned about conserving species that may be less common on the landscape, you maybe go for some of these less abundant habitats, like your Longleaf Pine Savannah, for example. Also has a very high diversity, but it tends to be a diversity of species that are less common on the landscape as a whole. So I hope that sort of answers that question. Again, it depends on what your targets are. To me, we can get more mileage by trying to conserve habitats that are less abundant on our landscape, like mature bottomland hardwoods or Longleaf Pine Savannah or something like that.
All right, great. Our next question is, how large an area can you clear cut before the loss of habitat outweighs the benefits for deer?
If you're talking about a pine-dominated landscape, I would say there's not an area large enough that you're going to get more benefit by having that mature closed canopy forest than you have by having what follows a clear cut. Now, there's some other concerns with aesthetics and stuff like that and other species, but from a deer perspective, the more sort of early successional shrubby growth you produce, the better it's going to be for them. So I would say there's no upper limit, although deer are an edge species, so that to the extent you can intersperse different habitats, your mature stands and your early successional stands, that's going to benefit deer. And if you're talking about hardwood stands, given the way our landscape sort of is right now, I think you're almost always going to provide more benefits to deer by having a mature, mass-producing hardwood stand than by cutting that stand down and producing browse. That browse, browse and escape cover is pretty abundant in our landscape. Mass production is not. So I would never recommend cutting down mature hardwoods to benefit deer. I think they're going to benefit more from mass production. So.
Okay, excellent. And our next question is from Tyson, who asks, are the greater than 2 hectare openings needed in areas with closed canopies, meaning greater than 85%, or are you suggesting in all areas, even those with already open tree spacings?
That's an excellent question. I assume we're referring to the turkey stuff here. And we've debated this a lot, and we've got a little group of folks that get together and from Texas Parks and Wildlife and researchers that get together and talk about turkeys, about whether, so if you have a landscape that is Longleaf Pine Savannah, for example, that has some of the characteristics of a grassland underneath your trees, does that sort of substitute for openings? And it's not clear. What we have so far suggests that not entirely. So there's still some value to having real openings without any trees in them, or very, very few trees. We had a site that we did a bunch of work on down near Huntsville, where most of their site was basically very well maintained Longleaf Pine Savannah. Really, they were very conservation minded. They had a very nice longleaf community over most of their property, and yet when we looked at turkey nesting out there, they would nest in that Longleaf Pine Savannah. They really liked that for nesting, but when they were raising poults, they would leave the Longleaf Pine Savannah and go to, they had several very large native meadows on this property, and the turkeys went, it was like a magnet. As soon as those poults hatched, the hens would take them and go to these openings and use those openings for about 3-4 weeks until those poults could fly extensively. So I think there's still some benefit to openings, even in an area that has open tree spacing, but certainly it's critical in those areas with closed canopies. You're really, both from a nesting and poult or brood rearing perspective, those openings are going to be critical. So it's more important in areas with closed canopies, but I think they're important even in areas that have open spacings in their trees.
All right. And our next question is, what herbicide is effective on mesquite trees for individual cut stump treatment? These trees are a maximum of 2 inches in diameter.
Yeah, again, I would say that Remedy, the triclopyr, is really good for these individual tree treatments. It's going to work on mesquite as well, particularly if you cut it off. So you're talking about cutting the tree, or tree, mesquite can end up being a thicket in a lot of cases, but cutting those stems off close to the ground and then spraying that stem, that triclopyr is really effective for that. But most of our common forestry herbicides are going to be pretty effective in that case. That would be the one I would recommend, probably if I were going to do that.
Okay, great. It looks like that wraps up most of our questions. Folks, if you want CEU credit, don't forget to fill out that survey and answer those questions at the end to provide us with your CEU information so we can make sure and get those certificates to you. Dr. Comer, on behalf of TWA and Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, I want to thank you very much for your time today and your excellent presentation. And folks, we want to thank you for tuning in and joining us and helping to make the 2012 Wildlife for Lunch webinar series such a success. Our next Wildlife for Lunch is going to be on January 17th of 2013. We'll have Linda Campbell of Texas Parks and Wildlife Department talking about wildlife tax valuations. And I'm putting a link up now for anyone who's interested in looking at the schedule for the 2013 Wildlife for Lunch series. We do have a flyer now available on the website. And again, you can always contact me if you have any questions. I'm going to put my email address in here now. Hopefully I am. And I'm not very good at typing one-handed. The survey will automatically open in your window when we close out of the webinar. And if you have any trouble or for some reason the survey doesn't pop open, just shoot me an email at cbritton@texas-wildlife.org, and I'll make sure and get that to you. And we look forward to having everyone back here hopefully on January 17th and throughout the 2013 Wildlife for Lunch webinar series. Dr. Comer, thank you so much, and thanks to all of y'all for taking time out of this very busy holiday time to be with us today.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
See you all soon.